Have you ever been around someone who slowly changes your energy without you even noticing it at first? In the beginning, everything feels normal. Maybe they seem confident, intelligent, even caring. You trust them, you open up to them, but over time, something strange starts happening. You feel emotionally drained after every conversation. You start doubting yourself more. Your peace disappears. Your confidence weakens. And the worst part is, you can't fully explain why. That's how toxic people operate. Not always loudly, not always aggressively. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who smile while quietly pulling your life apart from the inside. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius believed that one of the greatest forms of wisdom is learning to see people clearly, not emotionally. Because once emotions blind you, manipulation becomes easy. And in today's world, where appearances matter more than character, it has become harder than ever to recognize when someone has dark intentions behind a charming personality. That's exactly why this conversation matters. Because protecting your peace is not weakness, it's self-respect. And today, we're going to uncover 5 signs you may be dealing with an evil person through the lens of Stoicism, so you can stop ignoring the red flags and start protecting your mind, your energy, and your future. And if these conversations speak to something real in you, something grounded in truth, philosophy, and inner growth, consider subscribing. It's a small gesture, but it helps us reach more minds like yours, and it quietly signals that you're walking this path with intention. Sign 1. They use charm as a weapon. Some people walk into your life and immediately make you feel seen. They know how to talk to you in a way that feels effortless. They smile at the right moments, say the right things, and somehow make you feel important within minutes of meeting them. At first, it feels refreshing. You think you've met someone genuine, someone confident, someone who understands people deeply. And honestly, that's what makes this kind of person so dangerous. Because not everyone who makes you feel good intends to do good. Stoicism teaches us to be careful of becoming emotionally attached to appearances too quickly. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to look beyond surfaces and observe people through their actions rather than their presentation. And that lesson matters now more than ever. The truth is, charm can be a mask. Some people develop charisma not because they are virtuous, but because they know it gives them influence over others. They learn how to read emotions, how to gain trust quickly, and how to position themselves as likable before anyone has time to question their intentions. In modern psychology, this is sometimes connected to manipulative personality traits, where social intelligence is used not to connect, but to control. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Carl Jung. And sometimes, instead of building real character, people build an image designed to distract others from who they truly are underneath. You'll notice it slowly if you pay attention. In the beginning, they may seem incredibly attentive. They ask questions about your life, your struggles, your dreams. But over time, conversations start revolving around them. Your moments become interruptions to their performance. They dominate rooms. They constantly seek validation. And if someone else receives attention, you can almost feel their discomfort. Stoicism teaches emotional balance and observation. Instead of getting swept away by charisma, the Stoics would ask a much deeper question. Does this person demonstrate virtue consistently? Because true virtue does not need to perform constantly for approval. Imagine being around someone who always knows exactly what to say in public. Everyone loves them. Everyone praises them. They appear generous, funny, confident, and socially magnetic. But then you notice how differently they behave in private. Maybe they mock people behind their backs. Maybe they subtly humiliate others when nobody is paying attention. Maybe they become cold the moment they stop benefiting from someone. That contrast reveals everything. A genuinely good person behaves with integrity whether people are watching or not. A manipulative person carefully manages appearances because appearances are their source of power. This is why Stoicism places so much importance on rational observation instead of emotional reaction. Emotions are not always wrong, but they can blind us when admiration becomes attachment. The Stoics believed wisdom comes from learning to pause before assigning trust too quickly. Epictetus taught that we should examine impressions carefully before accepting them as truth. That means not confusing confidence with character, not confusing charm with honesty, and definitely not confusing attention with care. One of the clearest signs that someone uses charm as a weapon is how they react when they stop getting what they want. Pay attention to that moment. It reveals more than their charisma ever will. A person with strong character handles frustration calmly. They remain respectful even during disagreement. But someone who depends on charm for control often becomes irritated, defensive, or manipulative when their influence weakens. Suddenly, the warmth disappears. The kindness becomes conditional. And you start realizing the connection was never as genuine as you believed. Carl Jung also said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people." Carl Jung. That quote matters because manipulative people often succeed by targeting emotional weaknesses that remain unconscious within us. The need for validation, the desire to feel chosen, the fear of rejection. If you are unaware of those vulnerabilities, charm becomes incredibly powerful against you. But once you become aware of them, you stop being easily controlled by external attention. And this is where Stoicism becomes incredibly practical. Stoicism teaches you to stop depending on external approval for your sense of worth. Once you become grounded internally, charming people lose much of their influence over you because they can no longer manipulate your need for validation. You begin observing instead of idealizing, listening instead of fantasizing, watching patterns instead of getting intoxicated by moments. That doesn't mean becoming cold or paranoid. It means becoming wise. It means understanding that not every charismatic person is dangerous, but every dangerous person understands the value of charisma. And once you understand that distinction, your relationships begin to change. You stop rushing emotional connections. You stop handing people trust they haven't earned. You become calmer, slower, more observant. Very stoic. The powerful thing is this. People who use charm as a weapon often rely on others being emotionally impulsive. They expect people to ignore inconsistencies because the emotional experience feels good. But when you practice stoic awareness, you stop reacting only to how someone makes you feel in the moment. You begin evaluating whether their actions align with wisdom, honesty, self-control, and integrity over time. And honestly, that single shift can protect your peace more than almost anything else in life. Sign 2. They have no real empathy for others. There's something deeply unsettling about being around a person who can look directly at someone else's pain and feel absolutely nothing. At first, you may not even notice it because people without empathy are often skilled at appearing normal on the surface. They know how to smile at the right moments. They know how to say the right things when others are watching. But over time, you begin to feel the emotional emptiness underneath it all. You start noticing that your feelings never really matter to them unless those feelings somehow benefit them. And that realization can be painful because it forces you to accept something most people don't want to believe. That not everyone experiences human connection in the same way. Stoicism teaches that human beings are meant to live in harmony with one another through reason, justice, and mutual respect. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that we are all connected, like branches of the same tree. So when someone repeatedly shows a complete disregard for the emotional well-being of others, it reveals a serious fracture in their character. this is not simply a personality flaw. It becomes dangerous because empathy is one of the foundations that keeps human behavior restrained. Without empathy, guilt weakens, compassion disappears, and cruelty becomes easier. You can usually feel this type of person before you fully understand them. Imagine sharing something vulnerable with someone. Maybe you talk about anxiety, grief, heartbreak, or a difficult moment in your life. A healthy person pauses. They listen. They try to understand your emotions, even if they cannot fully relate to them. But someone lacking empathy reacts differently. They dismiss your feelings. They become irritated by your vulnerability. Or worse, they use your pain against you later, and suddenly, instead of feeling supported, you feel exposed, smaller, unsafe. Carl Jung once said, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." Carl Jung. That quote matters here because people without empathy often force you to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. They teach you that not everyone operates from kindness, conscience, or emotional depth. Some people see vulnerability not as something sacred, but as something useful. And once you understand that, you begin approaching relationships with greater awareness instead of blind trust. One of the clearest signs of low empathy is how a person reacts when others succeed. A genuinely kind person can celebrate someone else's happiness without resentment. But a person lacking empathy struggles with this because everything revolves around themselves. They may minimize your accomplishments, ignore your excitement, or subtly shift attention back onto themselves. You finally achieve something meaningful, and instead of feeling encouraged, you walk away from the interaction feeling strangely deflated. That emotional reaction is important. Stoicism teaches us to pay close attention to how certain people influence our inner state. Your peace is information. Your discomfort is information too. And here's something many people overlook. A lack of empathy is not always loud or aggressive. Sometimes it hides inside everyday behavior, constant interruptions, never asking how you are, ignoring boundaries, mocking emotions, refusing accountability. These small moments reveal far more than dramatic speeches ever could. Stoic philosophy emphasizes observation over emotional reaction. Don't just listen to what people claim about themselves. Watch patterns. Watch consistency. Watch how they treat people when there is nothing to gain from being kind. Seneca wrote, "Wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness." Seneca. A person without empathy misses that opportunity repeatedly, not because they forget, but because they simply do not value the emotional experience of others the way healthy people do. And over time, this creates destruction in every environment they enter. Friendships, relationships, workplaces, families, because eventually people around them begin feeling emotionally exhausted rather than emotionally safe. This becomes even more dangerous when combined with manipulation. Someone without empathy can lie without guilt, betray without remorse, humiliate without reflection. They can watch the emotional damage they cause and still justify their behavior because internally they do not process the pain of others deeply enough to stop themselves. That's why Stoicism places so much importance on virtue and self-awareness. A disciplined mind without virtue can become cold and destructive. True Stoic strength is never separated from compassion and justice. Another important thing to understand is that empathetic people are often targeted by emotionally empty individuals. Why? Because compassionate people tend to give endless chances. They try to understand everyone. They excuse harmful behavior because they project their own kindness onto others. But Stoicism warns against allowing emotions to blind judgment. Compassion without discernment becomes self-destruction. You can care about people while still recognizing that some individuals are unhealthy to keep close. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster." Friedrich Nietzsche. That balance is essential. When dealing with people who lack empathy, the goal is not to become cold or hateful yourself. The goal is clarity, boundaries, awareness. You do not need revenge. You do not need endless arguments. You simply need enough wisdom to stop expecting warmth from someone emotionally incapable of giving it. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all is accepting that some people will never change, no matter how patient, loving, or understanding you become. Stoicism teaches acceptance, not passive surrender, but acceptance of reality as it is. Once someone consistently shows you who they are, believe them. Stop hoping that your suffering will suddenly inspire their empathy. Protect your peace instead. Because your emotional energy is valuable, your kindness is valuable, and not everyone deserves unlimited access to it. Sign 3. They manipulate your mind and reality. There's a very dangerous moment that happens in toxic relationships, and most people don't notice it right away. It's the moment you stop trusting your own mind. At first, you feel certain about what happened. You know what was said. You know how someone made you feel. But after enough conversations, enough arguments, enough emotional confusion, you suddenly find yourself questioning everything. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I'm the problem. That kind of self-doubt doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's often the result of psychological manipulation, and Stoicism teaches us that once your perception becomes distorted, your peace disappears with it. Manipulative people rarely control you physically in the beginning. They control the story. They control the emotional atmosphere. They slowly reshape how you see yourself and the world around you. And the scary part is, they often do it so subtly that you don't even realize it's happening. One day they praise you and make you feel deeply valued. The next day they criticize you, withdraw affection, or act cold without explanation. This emotional inconsistency keeps you mentally off balance. You start chasing clarity from the very person creating the confusion. That's how manipulation works. It keeps you emotionally occupied, constantly trying to regain stability that they intentionally disrupted. The Stoics warned against becoming emotionally enslaved by external people and circumstances. Epictetus taught that when another person controls your emotions, they begin controlling your life. And manipulative individuals understand this better than most people realize. They know if they can trigger your guilt, fear, insecurity, or need for approval, they can influence your decisions without force. Suddenly, you're no longer acting from reason. You're reacting emotionally. And once emotions take over completely, clarity disappears. One of the most common manipulation tactics is making you doubt your own perception of reality. You confront someone calmly about something hurtful they did, and instead of accountability, they immediately flip the situation. They say you're too sensitive. They accuse you of being dramatic. They deny obvious events. Or they twist your words until you become mentally exhausted trying to explain yourself. Over time, this creates confusion inside your mind. You stop standing firmly in your own observations because you've been conditioned to second-guess yourself every time conflict appears. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Carl Jung, manipulative people often avoid responsibility by projecting their flaws onto others. Instead of confronting their dishonesty, insecurity, or cruelty, they make you carry the emotional burden for them. Suddenly, you're apologizing for things you didn't even do. You're over-explaining simple boundaries. You're trying to prove your intentions to someone who already decided to misunderstand you because confusion gives them power. And here's what makes this especially dangerous. Manipulation often hides behind emotional closeness. It's not always obvious hostility. Sometimes it's someone you deeply care about. A partner, a friend, a family member, someone whose approval matters to you. That emotional attachment makes it harder to recognize what's happening because part of you wants to protect the relationship. Stoicism reminds us that wisdom requires emotional discipline, not emotional numbness, but the ability to step back and observe situations clearly instead of getting swallowed by them. Imagine constantly walking on eggshells around someone because you never know which version of them you'll get. One day they're warm and supportive, the next day they're cold, critical, or distant. So you begin adjusting yourself to maintain peace. You become quieter, more cautious, more anxious. Little by little, your personality starts shrinking around their moods. This is how manipulation slowly steals freedom from people, not through force, but through emotional conditioning. Marcus Aurelius believed that the mind becomes colored by the thoughts it repeatedly entertains. Marcus Aurelius. When someone constantly feeds you confusion, guilt, fear, or self-doubt, your inner world begins absorbing it. That's why protecting your mental environment is so important. The Stoics understood that peace of mind is not automatic. It must be guarded carefully from influences that corrupt perception and weaken reason. One of the strongest things you can do in these situations is pause before reacting emotionally. Manipulators thrive on immediate reactions because emotional reactions are easier to control. But when you slow down, reflect calmly, and examine patterns instead of isolated moments, clarity starts returning. You begin noticing contradictions. You stop focusing only on their words and start observing their actions. And once you start seeing patterns clearly, manipulation loses much of its power. Another important lesson from Stoicism is this: you do not need endless validation from others to trust yourself. A manipulative person wants you dependent on their interpretation of reality. They want you constantly seeking reassurance, approval, or emotional stability from them, but true inner strength comes from developing confidence in your own judgment. That doesn't mean becoming arrogant or closed-minded. It means learning to trust your observations when behavior consistently reveals the truth. Carl Jung also said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Carl Jung, manipulative people often target insecurities you haven't fully healed within yourself. That's why self-awareness matters so much. The more grounded you are internally, the harder it becomes for someone else to emotionally destabilize you. Stoicism and psychology both point toward the same truth. Inner clarity protects you from external control. So if you constantly feel mentally exhausted around someone, if conversations leave you doubting your memory, your emotions, or your worth, don't ignore that feeling. Step back. Observe calmly. Look at patterns honestly, because protecting your mind is not selfish. It's necessary. And the moment you stop surrendering your perception to manipulative people is the moment you begin reclaiming your peace. Sign 4. They need to control every part of your life. At first, it doesn't feel dangerous. That's what makes it so difficult to recognize. In the beginning, it can actually feel comforting. Someone checking on you constantly. Someone wanting to know where you are, who you're with, what you're doing. They call it love. They call it care. They say things like, "I'm only worried about you," or "I just want what's best for you." And because human beings naturally want connection and security, it's easy to mistake control for affection. But Stoicism teaches us to look past emotional appearances and examine behavior with clarity. Because the moment another person begins slowly taking away your freedom to think, choose, and act independently, your peace starts disappearing without you even realizing it. One of the most dangerous things about controlling people is that they rarely demand power immediately. They build it gradually. Small comments become expectations. Expectations become rules. And eventually you notice that your life revolves around avoiding their reactions instead of following your own judgment. You stop wearing certain things because it upsets them. You stop talking to certain people because it creates tension. You start over-explaining harmless decisions just to keep the peace. and little by little you lose your sense of self. Marcus Aurelius believed that freedom begins within the mind. The Stoics understood that once fear controls your choices, you are no longer living freely, even if no physical chains exist. Carl Jung once said, "Where love rules, there is no will to power." Carl Jung. That quote reveals something powerful. Real love does not need domination. Real care does not require control. But toxic people often confuse possession with connection. They don't want partnership, they want influence, they want emotional leverage. And because they fear losing control, they constantly monitor, criticize, or pressure the people around them. You see this clearly in relationships where one person always has to approve everything. Suddenly, normal independence becomes suspicious. A simple outing with friends turns into an argument. A delayed text message becomes a personal attack. You begin feeling guilty for having your own space, your own thoughts, your own life outside the relationship, and that guilt becomes the mechanism through which control grows stronger. Stoicism warns us about emotional dependency because dependency makes manipulation easier. The more your emotional stability depends on another person's approval, the more power they gain over your inner world. And here's what makes this even more dangerous. Controlling people often position themselves as the victim whenever you resist them. The moment you try to establish boundaries, they act hurt, angry, or betrayed. Suddenly, your attempt to protect your peace becomes selfish. Your need for independence becomes cold. This creates emotional confusion because you begin questioning whether you are the problem. But the Stoics remind us that living virtuously sometimes requires disappointing people who benefit from your silence. Epictetus taught that no person is free if they are not master of themselves. The moment your decisions are controlled by fear of someone else's emotional reactions, your inner freedom starts collapsing. Control can also appear through isolation. This is one of the clearest warning signs. A controlling person slowly distances you from the people who support you most. They criticize your family. They question your friendships. They imply that nobody understands you the way they do. At first, these comments may seem small, even protective, but over time you realize your world has become smaller and smaller until they are at the center of it. And once isolation happens, control becomes much easier because you no longer have outside perspectives reminding you what healthy behavior looks like. The Stoics placed enormous value on strong communities and wise relationships because they understood how deeply human beings influence one another. Seneca wrote, "Associate with people who are likely to improve you." Seneca toxic control does the opposite. It weakens you emotionally while making you increasingly dependent on the person causing the harm. Another thing you'll notice is how controlling people react when they lose influence over you. Calm disappears. Respect disappears. Their kindness suddenly becomes conditional. The moment you say no, their behavior changes. Why? Because control was always the goal beneath the surface. A healthy person respects your boundaries even when disappointed. A controlling person sees boundaries as threats to their power. This is why Stoicism places so much importance on self-awareness and emotional discipline. If you do not know your own values, your own limits, and your own standards, someone else will eventually define them for you. And many people don't realize this until years later, when they wake up feeling emotionally exhausted and disconnected from the person they used to be. So how do you protect yourself from this kind of control? First, stop apologizing for healthy boundaries. You are allowed to have privacy. You are allowed to have independent thoughts. You are allowed to spend time with people who bring peace into your life. A Stoic mindset understands that protecting your inner stability is not cruelty. It is responsibility. Second, pay attention to how your body feels around certain people. Do you feel calm, respected, and free, or tense, anxious, and constantly cautious? Your nervous system often recognizes danger before your mind fully accepts it. Don't ignore that signal. And finally, remember this. The strongest people are not the ones who control others. The strongest people are the ones who control themselves. Stoicism teaches us that real power comes from self-mastery, not domination. So if someone constantly needs to dominate your emotions, your choices, or your identity to feel secure, they are revealing weakness, not strength. Protect your peace, protect your autonomy, because once you lose your inner freedom, rebuilding it becomes one of the hardest battles you will ever fight. Sign 5. They lie so naturally that reality becomes confusing. One of the most unsettling experiences in life is slowly realizing you can no longer trust your own perception around someone. At first, it starts small, tiny inconsistencies, little stories that don't quite match up. Maybe they tell you one thing today and a completely different version next week. Maybe you catch them exaggerating details for attention or changing facts depending on who they're talking to. And when you notice it, they brush it off so casually that you begin questioning yourself instead. That's what makes chronic liars so dangerous. They don't just deceive you. Over time, they distort your sense of reality itself. The Stoics warned about the importance of perception because they understood something profound. Once your mind becomes clouded, your peace disappears with it. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself to see things clearly without emotional distortion or illusion, but people who lie naturally thrive on illusion. They survive through confusion, and the longer you stay around someone like this, the harder it becomes to separate truth from manipulation. You start replaying conversations in your head, you start doubting your memory, you start wondering if maybe you misunderstood everything. That mental exhaustion is not accidental, it's the result of prolonged deception. What's frightening is how convincing some people can be. They lie with confidence, calmly, effortlessly. Sometimes they even seem believable because they mix truth with fiction so skillfully that it becomes almost impossible to catch the full deception immediately. And this is where many people get trapped. They keep searching for clarity from the very person creating the confusion. But clarity will never come from someone committed to dishonesty. Stoicism teaches us that wisdom begins when we stop ignoring what repeated behavior is showing us. Imagine dealing with someone who constantly changes their story depending on what benefits them most in the moment. One day they claim loyalty. The next day they deny promises they clearly made. They rewrite past events as if your memory means nothing. And if you confront them calmly instead of accountability, they become defensive, angry, or strangely persuasive. Suddenly, the conversation shifts away from their lie and onto your reaction. Now you're defending yourself instead of addressing the issue. That is emotional manipulation layered on top of dishonesty. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." Carl Jung. That's exactly what chronic lying often is. A desperate attempt to avoid truth, responsibility, or inner emptiness. Some people lie because they crave validation, others lie because they fear consequences, and some lie simply because controlling reality gives them power. But regardless of the reason, the effect on you remains the same: confusion, anxiety, emotional instability. The Stoics believed that truth is deeply connected to inner freedom. A person grounded in truth does not need endless performances to maintain their identity. But liars constantly perform. They constantly adjust masks depending on the audience. Around one group they appear kind. Around another they become the victim. Around someone else they become successful, wise, or misunderstood. Their personality becomes fluid because it is built on external approval instead of internal integrity. And eventually, maintaining all these false versions creates chaos not only for the people around them, but within themselves as well. One of the clearest signs you're dealing with someone like this is the feeling that you're always emotionally off balance around them. You never fully relax. You never feel secure in what's real. There's always a quiet tension in the background, even during normal conversations. Your instincts start speaking long before your mind fully catches up. Stoicism encourages us to listen carefully to these moments of internal discomfort instead of immediately dismissing them, because your awareness often notices danger before your emotions are ready to accept it. And here's something important to understand. Honest people can admit mistakes. Honest people may stumble, forget details, or even say the wrong thing sometimes, but when confronted with truth, they correct themselves. A pathological liar does the opposite. They double down. They become evasive. Or they create even more lies to cover the original one. It becomes an endless cycle where accountability never truly arrives. Seneca believed that a liar should have a good memory. Seneca. And eventually most deceptive people expose themselves through their own contradictions. The danger of staying around constant dishonesty is that it slowly damages your relationship with yourself. You stop trusting your instincts. You start over-analyzing everything. You become hypervigilant, emotionally exhausted, and mentally scattered. This is why Stoicism places so much importance on mental clarity and emotional discipline. Protecting your peace sometimes means accepting painful truths instead of endlessly searching for comforting lies. So what do you do when you recognize these patterns? First, stop arguing with reality. Stop trying to force honesty out of someone committed to deception. Observe calmly, detach emotionally, focus on actions instead of promises, and most importantly, trust consistency over charm. People can manipulate words for years, but patterns eventually reveal everything. Carl Jung also said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Carl Jung. Many people lie because they cannot face who they truly are. But that is their battle, not yours. Your responsibility is to protect your clarity, your integrity, and your peace of mind. Because once truth disappears from a relationship, emotional safety disappears with it. And this is where Stoicism becomes powerful. It teaches you not to become bitter, paranoid, or hateful. It teaches you to become aware, calm, grounded, unshaken by deception, because you no longer depend on other people's words to recognize reality. You learn to observe quietly, think clearly, and walk away when someone repeatedly shows you that truth means nothing to them. That kind of awareness is not a weakness, it's wisdom. Now here's the most important thing to understand. Stoicism is not about becoming cold or paranoid, it's about becoming aware. Because once you recognize toxic behavior clearly, you stop personalizing it. You stop blaming yourself for other people's darkness, and instead you focus on protecting your inner world. You don't need revenge. You don't need endless arguments. You don't need to prove your worth to manipulative people. Your responsibility is to preserve your clarity, your values, and your peace of mind. So trust your observations. Trust patterns over promises. Trust actions over words. And remember this, every time you walk away from toxic behavior, you make space for a healthier, stronger version of yourself to emerge. And always remember that protecting your peace is not weakness, it's wisdom. If this conversation opened your eyes, don't stop here. Watch one of the suggested videos on your screen because it will help you go even deeper into emotional mastery, self-respect, and Stoic strength. And thank you for being a part of Psychresto Mind.